Our next presenters are a dynamic duo, Matthew Goldman and Justin Rao. Matthew is an economics PhD student at the University of California, San Diego, whose research is centered around econometrics and game theory. Justin is a behavioral economist at Yahoo Research, who has a PhD in economics from UCSD. His research focuses on belief formation, information processing, and strategic decision-making. Today, they will be speaking with us about their research on the impact of pressure on performance. And one final reminder, afterwards in the Q&A, please use the mic at the back. And with that, to hear about what makes some players choke under pressure, I will turn the podium over to Justin.
Yeah.
You can use this if you want to.
Okay. Okay, thanks for coming to our talk. I'd like to thank the organizers once again. This is a great conference and a pleasure to be here. And if you came to the talk yesterday, I'd recommend leaving now. It's the exact same thing. Unless you really want to see it twice, but it's not that great. Okay, now we'll get going. So today's talk is about how pressure impacts people, and the people are NBA players. They're people just like us. They're a little taller, and they make a little more money. But we're going to start out, because they're people, we're going to start out with some motivating questions about how pressure psychologically just does impact human beings. And the first question would be, how does pressure impact performance? Even in your life, you face situations of varying degrees of pressure of the moment, and it probably is important to know how pressure affects you in those moments so you can prepare and take steps to mitigate the pressure or the psychological impact of that pressure. Another question is there a differential impact of pressure depending on what you're doing? So are some tasks very susceptible to pressure or pressure-deteriorated performance, and some tasks not? This paper will address that question specifically. And a question that psychologists have addressed is there more pressure in front of an audience that supports you or opposes you? So is an adversarial audience easier to perform in front of than a supportive audience? That's something that has been addressed in smaller scale laboratory studies. Today we're going to address that in the context of NBA arenas. And from a sports perspective, is the notion of home choke real? So some of you might have read articles about English golfers faring particularly poorly in the British Open. There's other sort of anecdotal evidence of people, sort of NASCAR drivers not performing as well at certain tracks where they have fans and things like this. Those studies, I think they might be representing a real effect. The problem is that, for instance, take the instance of golf, it's hard to know how well that player should have done, and there's actually very few English players that realistically could win the British Open every year. In fact, most years, it's probably zero, to be realistic. The chance of anyone winning is less than 1%, or any English golfer winning is probably less than 1%. So over the last century, one English golfer should have won the British Open. Well, zero did. Big deal, you know? Maybe they're choking, maybe the English dudes just aren't that good at golf. To motivate these questions from a psychology point of view, there's two main reasons psychologists think pressure can impact performance. The first is what we call increased self-focus. So self-focus is when you're doing a task, whether it be a perceptual motor task or solving an algebra problem, self-focus is thinking about how you do it, and too much self-focus is thinking too much about that. So you can imagine swinging a golf club. One way to do it is just to focus and then swing and hit it. The other way to do it is to say, pull it back straight, lock my left elbow, turn my hips, then follow through, square my shoulders, and turn. And thinking about all those 9 steps independently in a procedural fashion is what we call too much self-focus. That can actually foul you up. It can lead to poor outcomes. And in fact, anyone that does play golf on the first tee, they're probably thinking these things, and the ball probably doesn't go very far. So increased self-focus is sort of the anti-Nike. Instead of just doing it, you're thinking about how to do it, and that tends to hamper performance. And this is shown to be true in psychology studies for things as far-ranging as solving a math problem to doing a perceptual motor task like shooting a basketball or putting a golf ball. Another way pressure might impact you in a negative way is through increased distraction. So if you have trouble focusing, instead of too much focus, you actually have trouble just addressing the task at hand. So imagine maybe a student with test anxiety of a different sort, where they literally just cannot sit down and look at the question. They can't read the passage without getting distracted and thinking about too many things. As a human being, you're blessed with a lot of great facilities, but one thing you're not blessed with is a great working memory. So probably no one in this room can memorize a 10-digit number that easily, quickly. 2-digit number, if I said 22, remember that, you'd say 22, I'm an adult, 22. But if I said 2, 2, 4, 7, 6, 8, 3, what's that number? Maybe some of you have, Dustin Hoffman brain, but most of us would say, stop spitting numbers at me. You're not as funny as you think you are. So you have about 6 digits. So if you have about 6 digits worth of working memory, if you're distracting 2 of those digits by thinking about how important this moment is when you're trying to do a math problem or trying to do something that requires attention, that might screw you up. So there's 2 hypotheses here, self-focus versus distraction. And psychology studies, especially ones on perceptual motor action, have tended to point to self-focus too much self-focus as the reason for deterioration in performance under pressure. And what this finding makes is a key prediction. It says performance deterioration under pressure should come into play when self-focus can creep in. And we'll talk about 2 situations in the NBA today, one in which too much self-focus really can creep in, and the other, which is done in the heat of the moment, where it's not as plausible that self-focus is going to be a problem. So evidence in favor of sort of a few studies that support this finding. Golf putters do worse under pressure when they think about the stroke. So what I mean there is that if you teach people to play golf, one group of people, you teach them procedural elements of the golf swing. Another group of people, you just do it through motions. You don't tell them A, B, and C. The people that learned A, B, and C do worse under pressure. When you heighten the pressure, they start doing worse. Under no pressure conditions, they do very similarly. And then actually distracting people can help under pressure. So if you say to your kid that's having trouble under pressure, just say, sing a song to yourself, or in psychology studies, call out a random number at odd intervals. So you're under pressure, but you say, hey, every 10 seconds, every 30 seconds, just say a random letter. Just do that. Just think about that for a little bit too. That tends to help people. That's obviously very distracting. It would be very annoying to have someone tell you to do this in real life. But it actually helps people. So it seems that distraction is not what's mediating the pressure, the negative impact of pressure. Rather, it's too much self-focus. So in terms of how how a supportive audience can impact performance, there's definitely evidence that a supportive audience can inspire effort. I think this is a very solid finding in psychology. So supportive audience make you try harder. They also might exert more pressure on you because you don't want to disappoint them. So imagine doing anything in your life, and then imagine like your mom, dad, grandma, and uncle watching, and they got paid like $5,000 if you succeeded. But they're just looking at you silently. That's probably more pressure than doing it with just 10 random strangers that didn't get paid anything if you succeeded. The idea that supportive audience make you try harder would say is that in tasks where trying harder helps, that's a good thing. So imagine running 400 meters. You try harder, you run a little faster. That's great. Supportive audience helped you. Imagine doing something like shooting a free throw. Is trying harder to make a free throw going to help you make a free throw when you have to concentrate and do something, a fine motor task? The idea is that in that case, the increased effort will not lead to an increased performance. It might actually lead to overthinking the task. The question this paper addresses specifically is, do these results that are built on the back of novices, undergraduates going into psychology labs, are they going to generalize to highly paid, very highly incentivized experts at the task? And that paper is going to address that with NBA free throw shooting and offensive rebounding. So what this paper does, it says, I want 2 tasks within the same game that have roughly equivalent value, but differ widely on the dimension of, does it require concentration or does it require effort? And so a free throw, if you make a free throw, that's worth 1 point. It's pretty obvious. Turns out getting an offensive rebound for your team is worth about 1 point on average in terms of how well your team does going forward on that possession. So comparable value. Now free throw shooting, you do it at self-paced. You shoot the shot at your discretion when you want to shoot the shot, and you do so when everybody else is standing still. It requires concentration. It's more like taking a test. It's one of those tasks where self-focus can really creep in. Offensive rebounding, it requires effort. It might require some form of thought, like getting to the right position. We saw a paper yesterday about how important getting in the right position is, but it's a more effort-based task, and most importantly, it's done in the heat of the moment. You're not sitting there thinking about it. You're just playing, right? So it's something that self-focus, probably not likely to be a major factor effort probably more likely to be a major factor. So what we're going to do in this paper is first empirically quantify pressure by saying how important is each point in our sample. So if you score a point, how important is that for your team? That's going to be our measure of pressure, and we're going to look at how pressure varies with home versus away. So I'm about to turn it over to Matt, but I'll show you our metric for importance or pressure is take a game situation. What I'm showing you here is a 3D plot. On one x-axis is how much the home team is ahead or behind, so 0 is a tie game. On the x-axis, or the y-axis, which is moving away from you, is how much time is remaining in the game. That spine is at 0 margin of victory, or 0 margin for the game. So what I'm showing you here is, at any game situation, in the model we're going to control for what teams are playing each other, but this is for a generic matchup, take a margin and how much time is remaining in the game. The win value of a point, or the importance of that point, says, compared to sort of situation A, which is being down by 6 with 15 minutes to play, how much more likely I'm going to win the game if I'm down by 5 with 15 minutes to play? That difference is how important that point is. What this graph is saying is that at the end of the third quarter, with 12 minutes remaining, at a tie game, points are worth about 4 percentage points. So scoring a point increases your chance of winning by 4 percentage points. So it's a pretty high value shot. For the fourth quarter, intuitively, this picks up where the other graph left off, coming towards you. For the fourth quarter, this increases dramatically as we get to the end of the game. So we see that within a sort of close margin, within a 3-point margin, less than 3 minutes, you have very high important shot. Every shot, every point, every free throw is going to increase your chance of winning the game by 8 to 10 percentage points. And that's the kind of pressure situation we're going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Matt. He's going to take you through the results. Take it away, Matt.
All right, thanks a lot, Justin. So now that we have some intuition for exactly how it is we're going to quantify pressure and tell you how important any given moment of the game is, let's go ahead and look at our two tasks and try and look at exactly how performance by NBA players and NBA teams is actually correlated with this definition of the pressure or the impact of the moment. And so the first task we want to look at, as Justin was saying, is rebounds. And the idea we have when we look at rebounds is rebounds are very much an effort task, where if you want it more, if you're willing to fight harder, you'll fight harder for position, you might jump a little higher, that might actually lead to higher levels of success, right? And so what our basic finding is when we look at rebounds is we look at how different teams do in terms of offensive rebounding. And the basic finding is that the home team actually sees a statistically significant improvement in their performance in high-pressure situations, right? So going from a low-pressure situation, where all the way on the left side of the axis, the win value of a point is basically 0. You know, that's a situation where you're up 15, the game's over, points are meaningless. In that situation, the home and the away team do basically equally well at rebounding. But as you can see, as the win value of a point starts to increase, the home team's offensive rebounding rate goes up gradually. And in fact, that's actually a very statistically significant increase from about 29% in a meaningless situation all the way up to 33% in a very high-pressure situation where the game is on the line. However, when you look at the away team, the offensive rebounding rate hovers around 30% the whole way. It looks maybe like it's going up at the end, but that's actually not a statistically significant increase, okay? So just so there's no confusion, this is strictly an offensive rebounding rate. Defensive rebounding rates for both the home and the away team are going to be 1 minus the fractions you see on the screen. And so similarly, the defensive rebounding rate for the home team in this situation is staying level, whereas the defensive rebounding rate for the away team is actually going down. So it's very clear that as the pressure mounts, the home team maybe they want it more, they fight a little bit harder, and in a very statistically significant way, they show greater improvement in their offensive rebounding than the away team does in clutch situations. Now, in contrast to the very effort-oriented task of rebounding, where we think wanting it more and really fighting harder is going to improve you, we're comparing this to a concentration task, a task where, as Justin was saying, a lot of self-focus might creep in and really impact our ability to perform. And the whole idea here is that as the pressure mounts in this kind of concentration task, players might want it too much. You know, they're sitting there in front of a supportive audience, everyone's watching them, they really, really are thinking about how they can succeed. They sit there and think about all the steps, and the end result we find is that when aggregating over all the players in the NBA, there is actually a very significant decline in the average free throw performance in clutch situations by the home team. However, the away team does not seem to show any effect whatsoever of being in the clutch. And just to quickly show you that this is significant, this is averaging over all the players. So obviously the first step in this analysis, different players shoot free throws at different rates. So the first step here is definitely to do analysis on each individual player. And for each individual player, the results are frequently noisy, and I'll talk more about that later. But when we average over the whole league, it's very clear, first of all, that in non-clutch situations, which is the bottom line, the home team is improving in a statistically significant way. but that in clutch situations, there's a very significant interaction where the home team is doing much worse, right? And so you can see that very clearly on this picture right here, where what we're looking at right now is how the away, or excuse me, in regular situations, how the away and the home team are performing. And what you can see is that there's looking at the confidence bars, that's a 95% confidence interval. The home team is actually doing a little bit better than the away team in regular situations. And maybe that's some kind of generic home court advantage. They're comfortable with their rims. They're more well-rested. You know, who knows why they're doing a little bit better. But what you see is that in clutch situations, the away team's performance might be a little bit higher, but the home team sees a drastic decline. So in clutch situations and situations where the game is on the line, and in this particular case, to calculate these numbers, we use sort of a typical clutch situation where the win value of a point is approximately 0.08 points. And as Justin was showing you on the graph, that corresponds to a situation where the game might be tied with about 3 minutes left, or maybe you're down 1 or 2 with 2 minutes left. In those kinds of situations, the home team actually experiences, or excuse me, a 2 percentage point drop almost a 2 percentage point drop from their normal ability to shoot free throws. And obviously that's subject to a certain amount of variability based on our limited sample size, but it's very clear that's a significant effect as I was showing you. So this is cool, right? This is an interesting result. We've definitely shown you that there's an average effect here where the home team is seeing a statistically significant decrease. Pressure is having some kind of effect when aggregated over all the players in the NBA. And that's a cool result, but I think the really interesting question a lot of people care about is can I look at NBA players and can I pick out the clutch guys and can I pick out the chokers, right? And so obviously I told you we did this analysis on a player-by-player basis. We had to because different players shoot free throws in a different way. And so when we break it down, we do have coefficients for every individual player. And there are some guys who stand out and look like they respond to pressure at home. You know, they have a different kind of home choke phenomenon at the foul line than the average player in our sample, okay? And so what you see is that out of our sample of 441 players, I apologize for the typo on the slide, only 25 guys, though, are different from the mean of the group in a statistically significant way. And if you know much about hypothesis testing, you know that it's perfectly normal when you run a test on lots and lots of players to get about 5% of them to look statistically different. So based on this result, even though there are some guys who are pretty extreme outliers, it's not clear that anyone is really different from the mean of the group based on our limited ability to observe them in this particular study. One guy who did look a little bit different was Manu Ginobili, who actually he had a T statistic of 3.68, which is very unlikely to happen by chance. I think that'll happen less than 1 in 1,000 times that a T statistic that high will arise if Manu Ginobili really was the same as everyone else in the group. So if you thought Manu Ginobili was interesting, you thought maybe he was a clutch player, and I think there are a lot of Spurs fans who definitely think that, then you'll look at this and you'll say, yeah, I totally believe that guy gets better than in the clutch. But an important thing to remember is that, again, when you look at 441 guys, every now and then you are going to get a really high p-value. And actually, as Justin was making this point to me earlier, if you do 441 t-tests, there's actually about a 1 in 10 chance that someone shows up who looks like Manu Ginobili. So it depends on what your prior is about how to think about Manu Ginobili, but this looks like pretty strong evidence that he is different from his peers. And finally, one other thing we wanted to mention, it wasn't extremely predictive of who was clutch, but we did find in general that good free throw shooters were a little bit less likely to choke in high pressure situations at the foul line at home. And that was actually statistically significant with a T of 3.09, which again is very unlikely to happen by chance, less than a half a percentage point chance that we got those results when there was really nothing going on. But at the same time, that's really just a correlation. It's definitely there, but it's not really predictive in terms of telling us who is clutch and who's not. So just quickly, I told you we had individual estimates for every single player. Here's a quick look at the 25 guys who looked like they were different from the mean of the group, either in terms of being particularly clutch, and you see Manu Ginobili, Robert Horry, and a couple other names who don't really look like they belong there on the clutch side, and then lots of other guys on the non-clutch side. And so obviously this table, some parts of it look intuitive, some parts of it don't, but obviously the parameter values are kind of all over the place. And what's sort of going on here is there's all kinds of statistical noise that we see when we try and estimate who's clutch and who's not. You know, we only see so many free throw attempts from any individual player. And some of them are in clutch situations, some of them are not, some of them are on the away side, some of them are not. So it's not always obvious, you know, whether or not we're actually learning something interesting about these guys or we're just being confounded by sampling variability. And so I think a really important and a really interesting question is whether or not this variability, these differences between players that you see between the clutch guys and the not-so-clutch guys is really real. You know, we might watch the game or look at a limited amount of data, and we might be convinced that one guy's clutch and one guy's not. And what we want to do is we want to test whether or not that's a reasonable belief for you to have, that some guys are clutch and some guys are chokers. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at, again, this sample of all this variability in observed choking coefficients, and we're going to think about the amount of sampling variability we would expect to have. And we're going to try and difference that out and see if there's enough variability in these coefficients for us to believe that there's actually a lot of differences between players in terms of how clutch they are and how much they choke. And so when we do that analysis, basically, and this is obviously a very difficult process. We're kind of trying to difference out measurement error in this very difficult way. And we do that process in order to make it a little easier. We're going to model the distribution of the choke parameter, beta home court, or beta home choke. We call that the choke parameter, is coming from some normal distribution. And we're going to try and estimate the parameters of that normal distribution. The mean of that distribution is just sort of the mean choking effect observed across the league. I think a few slides back, you saw that parameter was like negative 0.13. And that's kind of the 95% confidence interval on that mean choking effect. There's nothing new or interesting going on there. But I think the variance parameter is really interesting, because that's, again, based on backing out, based on how much variability there was in these coefficients, differencing out the sampling noise, that's how much variability it really looks like there is between players. And the nice thing is that confidence interval is entirely outside 0. So that means I can tell you that different players do seem to have different levels of clutchness. There are differences between players. Some guys are clutch and some guys are chokers. But at the same time, that standard deviation of 0.316 is kind of a pretty good upper bound on how big that variability could be. So we can say pretty confidently, actually, if you work through the math and you go back to that typical situation I was talking about, a typical kind of moderately clutch situation, the game is tied, 3 minutes left, 1 point improves your chances to win by 8 percentage points. In that kind of a situation, we can basically say there are very few NBA players who either choke so much that they're missing 5% more of their free throws than normal, or are so clutch that they're making more than 3% more than normal. So again, the mean is about a 2 percentage point drop. Some guys do better, some guys do worse, some guys might be a little clutch, some guys might be chokers, but there's not a whole lot of room to believe that some guys are really always going to get the job done in the clutch, and other guys are always going to choke. All right, so just to quickly wrap up, what was the presentation about? What did we tell you guys today? So again, we're looking at the impact of pressure on NBA players, sort of as a lens to get at how pressure impacts people in their day-to-day lives and in more realistic situations. The basic findings, we take advantage of a home versus away difference, and also between the concentration versus an effort task dynamic. And the basic finding is that home players get more motivated, they get fired up, they try harder in the clutch, and that results in an improvement in their performance in an effort task. They want it more and they fight harder for a rebound, but it hurts their performance when they're trying to focus in a concentration task, like shooting a free throw. Results are consistent with the self-focus hypothesis and the psychological research in the home choke phenomenon Justin was talking about, but they also do allow for us the traditional notion of home field advantage that we've always believed in. All right, thank you very much, and if you have any questions.
Hi, so yeah, I'm curious as to whether it's possible that you can explain the difference in offensive rebounding rates by a referee bias. So referees might be less likely to call an offensive foul on an over-the-back rebound or over-the-top rebound than against the home team than against the away team. So do you think that's possible, or is there a way you could check that effect?
So that is definitely possible. One thing we can look into is we can look at team rebounds versus individual rebounds. And so team rebounds are situations where there was an over-the-back call or someone deflects it out of bounds, and we can look at that as on an individual basis. And you are absolutely right. In clutch situations and in general, the home team gets more of those calls, but that was not enough to put a big dent in the gap we showed you. One question you could look at is, maybe because these guys are particularly emboldened, because they know they can get away with over-the-back calls, they play more aggressive, and they get more individual rebounds too. So if you really wanted to take that line of thought very seriously, you could reconsider the rebounding result. But at the same time, it's not a gap that exists in all kinds of other situations. And so it's, the refs would have to be trying to help the home team only in the high leverage moments and not in the low leverage moments. And you would need a very specific theory of the way the refs were manipulating the game to get that result. So.
Also to the 4 percentage point increase the home team gets, which is about 12 or 15% of the baseline, the amount of bias increase in referees would have to go up by an enormous amount given the base rate of fouls called on offensive rebound. So it's not something that fouls are called on that frequently enough that you really would have to get like a 500% increase in bias to get this. And we're in extending these results to college and other areas where referees might be more susceptible to home field bias. That's something that we'll always take into account to adjust the estimates. That's a good question. Thank you. All right. One more question? All right.
you showed someone like Manu being very clutch, at the end of games. That was only considering his free throw shooting, right?
Correct.
Was there anyone that stood out as being abnormally clutch in terms of their offensive rebounding capability?
So the way we measure offensive rebounds is for the team as of available offensive rebounds, and we do have the lineups on the court, but I can't say off the top of my head which players are showing up. We did have some preliminary analysis that said the teams with better offensive rebounders tended to show more improvement, but I'd have to check specifically just which lineups look like they're the outperforming ones. We could certainly do the exact same analysis we did with free throw shooters and said instead of a list of guys, a list of lineups, but then they pull out the one or two big guys that are grabbing the highest fraction of rebounds. So unfortunately, we don't have that data available today, but it's certainly the exact same procedure can back that out.
Sure. So you use team offensive rebounding, not individual offensive rebounding percentage. Okay.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Cool.
And your point about late buckets impacting wins more.
Yep.
I can never get my head around this thing. Like, if you end up with a 2-point lead, let's say with a minute left, does it matter if that bucket was just scored or was earlier? Right?
It doesn't.
So there's not actually a more important time of the game to score?
So yeah, so the way to think about it, it's an interesting, as an economist, this way you sort of teach things. A game that's decided by 1 point, every basket was pivotal. It's just like voting. If you're the last voter to vote, or the first voter to vote, if the election was decided by 1 vote, everyone was pivotal. But at the start of an early game, or the middle of an early game, the chance the game ends close is low. At the end of a close game, the chance the game ends close is high. So although every time the game ends by a 1-point margin, it's pivotal, at the end of a close game, that's a much more likely scenario. So it's all based on this probability of pivotalness. So we're not fudging it. So that's actually why the intuitive notion, as a fan, no one says, like if I was in a press conference and I was a backup player and I scored 1 point and the game decided by 1 point, they said, oh, what do you think of Kobe's game-winning shot? No, screw that. I hit a free throw in the second quarter. That's absolutely true. And in the end, that point had a huge leverage. But in expectation at that game situation, the chance that game ended up 1-point game was low. But with 1 minute left in a tie game, the chance it ends up 1-point game is high. And so that's where it all comes from. So it's a good question. It's important to keep in mind, just like your voting intuition. Vote first or vote last. But if you knew the election was close, if they said, hey, a friend called you up, it's 50-50, you're like, oh, I better go vote. It's more important.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.